Okay, thank you for the very kind introduction. Thank you so much for having me. I couldn't be more excited to be here. It's an amazing opportunity to tell a story that all of us, I think, should be very proud of. Uh, if you go back to the spring of 2020 and just try to remember where we were, and then now fast forward, of course, to where we are, I think perhaps the most important thing that we can do is to go back and learn from what we accomplished together and then look forward and to think about how we might leverage those learnings to tackle some really important challenges that still remain. So when I was thinking about putting this talk together, it was actually incredibly inspiring to think back about the tremendous teamwork that emergently came together to tackle a really important societal challenge that was bearing down upon us. And now, kind of looking in the rearview mirror a little bit, I think the most exciting lesson is that if we can accomplish SHIELD, just imagine what we can do together moving forward. There are, of course, major challenges we still face as society. The fact that they've been around for a long time perhaps means that unfortunately they feel a little less urgent than the pandemic when it was coming down upon us. But they're nonetheless, at least, if not more impactful for our daily lives. And so I'll end the talk today with a little bit of a look forward with the hopes that some of the lessons that we learned from what we accomplished together with SHIELD could be incredibly powerful and enabling as we look forward together about new challenges that we might face. So that's the roadmap that I'm hoping to accomplish today. This is the place that we call home. It's my favorite picture of the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. You can see the entire campus, okay, from this view. And of course, in the spring of 2020, everything that we love about our home, and of course, all across the state and the country and the world, things we had taken for granted, all of a sudden everything felt vulnerable. At the University of Illinois, first and foremost, this meant our students' education, right? This is what we're all about. Our job is to help position the next generation to lead the world and do so in a very impactful way. And all of a sudden, all of this felt very much at risk. This included our teaching, where we do our primary responsibility of hopefully trying to teach those young people everything they're going to need to know to at least get off to a great start as they tackle their own challenges moving forward. This included our research labs. So we are primarily a research-focused institution. Our other very important contribution to the world is to hopefully ask important questions and try to find useful answers. And all of this, all of a sudden, felt at risk. As mentioned, we had just started a brand new College of Medicine with a concept to create physician innovators, a new idea of kind of what the future of medicine might look like. And all these amazing young people showed up expecting the opportunity to turn that concept into reality. And again, around February or March of 2020, this looked like an ominous situation. And of course, at Illinois, we do a lot more than just teach and research. We compete, and we have student athletes who leverage their experience in that context to go on and do even higher, greater things in their own lives. And again, this looked like a very difficult situation. And at Illinois, we have another reputation. So being the overachievers that we are, and not to be undone, just prior to the pandemic, we had been ranked the #1 party school in the entire country. And then we had this challenge. We are a university of 50,000 students and about as many other members, faculty, and staff. And we are in the middle of a community, hundreds of thousands of people in Champaign County. And very early modeling suggested that bringing students back to a university in the fall, if viral transmission was uncontrolled, could have devastating consequences to the surrounding community. And this was sobering. And there's, of course, behind this image, there's a picture. Take the University of Illinois, and we can here see that that beautiful university has this amazing community around it. And all of those individuals were vulnerable. And if we brought 35,000 undergraduates back to Champaign, Illinois, and didn't control transmission, we had the risk, as unfortunately happened in many other places, of that transmission amongst the undergraduates spilling over into our faculty and our staff, who are much more vulnerable, and the entire Champaign County. And so this is the faces that we were really worried about. And when our provost, Andreas Congelares, called me in April one night and said, would you lead a team, stand up a team with the goal of trying to mitigate transmission on campus so that we could protect our faculty, staff, our students, and our surrounding community. It was with tremendous humility, but also a lot of intense commitment that myself and then every single person I called after he talked to me that night said yes. And the goal was to figure out a way to make sure we could still do all of those important things, the teaching, the research, ultimately the athletics, even some of the fun, and do it in a way that would keep our community safe. And that was not just, of course, our local community, but our surrounding community as well. So we landed on this concept that we called SHIELD, which was named intentionally to represent its primary purpose. The goal was to protect our community. We recognized very early on that testing was going to be really important, and we're going to talk a lot about that. But we also realized testing alone was not going to be enough. It was clear from all of the evidence that this was going to require a comprehensive, kind of multi-dimensional approach. And so we intentionally described the SHIELD platform as a three-pronged strategy: data science-driven targeting of who to test, when to test, how often to do it. We know we were going to need a test, and a really good one, which wasn't available yet. And we needed a communication strategy for rapid dissemination of results and turning the results of the test into action. And we'll talk about that in a lot more detail as well. Breaking that down just a bit, we imagined, again, kind of three pillars of the SHIELD platform. We were very fortunate, and I'll introduce some of the players in just a moment, just to have phenomenal team members across this entire framework. We were able to do frontier kind of data science-driven targeting. We'll tell the story about how a brand new saliva test was created that had the opportunity to meet the demands that was required based on the data science recommendations, and then ultimately a communications platform that was able to very rapidly disseminate the results and thereby turn the data from the test into actionable outcomes and prevention of COVID spread. Okay, so the story that I'm going to tell you today, we've written up. If you're interested in the details, this was published in Nature Communications about 1.5 years ago. And ultimately, it's the culmination of an extraordinary team. And this was really, I think, one of the most exciting, powerful, inspiring aspects of the whole story. Once we all locked arms and decided to go after this together, the power of that team really manifested itself in ways that I think was just incredibly inspiring. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we were successful in mitigating transmission of SARS-CoV-2 at a large public university. And as a result, we were able to share with the world a playbook for how to do that. And we were very excited that this actually turned out to be a very useful playbook for many other communities, not only our state, but our country and around the world. And so the story I'll tell you today starts at the little microcosm of Champaign-Urbana at UIUC. But as you know, we're very fortunate that it ended up having far-reaching consequences. This is just a small subset of the people who were involved. And I'm going to do my very best to try to highlight some of the teammates along the way, but by no means will it be comprehensive, because unfortunately there's just not enough time to tell every one of these amazing stories. When I was trying to put this talk together, it was a kind of an intensive trip down memory lane, just kind of thinking about all the incredible stories associated with each of these individuals. I'm just going to be able to highlight a few of them who were playing leadership and/or specific roles in different aspects of the story that I'm going to highlight today. So on our target team, we were very fortunate to have just top-notch leaders in epidemiology, data science, computational modeling, et cetera. This is Rebecca Smith, Nigel Goldenfeld, and Ahmed Albana. And together, they were like the all-star team for data science and modeling. And in fact, Nigel Goldenfeld and Sergey actually had been very much involved with the state of Illinois prior to the launch of SHIELD, trying to model the pandemic dynamics across the state and working together with state officials. So we had a head start in terms of trying to think about how we might put together a program that could do this. The challenge is that these three are very rigorous and very honest. And early on, they told us that once a week testing of everyone, which seemed like a off-scale heroic challenge, was not going to be enough. So the original modeling data came back and said once per week and we will fail. And they came back and said twice per week is going to be necessary. 50,000 people twice per week. If you do the math, it's 100,000 tests per week, and there was no known test that could possibly do that. Remember, this is back when the only thing available was really the nasopharyngeal swab. As our Chancellor Jones likes to call it, the brain swab. This was not popular, and doing 100,000 of those every week was just not even close to possible. So luckily, instead of retreating, we were very fortunate to have a phenomenal team led by Paul Hergenrother and Tim Phan, who refused to accept failure as a possibility and decided to go after a test that could achieve 100,000 tests per week. Ultimately, as I'll describe, this led to what we now know as the covidSHIELD assay, a direct saliva to PCR assay that has transformed the way we treated the pandemic locally as well as in many other areas, and I'll tell you exactly how we got there. And then finally, we needed a communication strategy because all the data science suggested that testing wasn't enough. We'd have to turn the testing into offense, right? We didn't want to play defense against SARS-CoV-2. We wanted to be on the offense. And if we could figure out who was infected before they were infectious, this was the key. And in order to do that, as soon as we knew someone was infected, they had to know and they had to get isolated. Okay, so that time window was critical in the modeling. And this was the key resource that we used to achieve that. Bill Sullivan and John Paul created an app that we called Safer in Illinois that was able to directly take the test results to the person's phone within minutes. And this was allowing then isolation to proceed very quickly, which the modeling suggested if we could pull all of that off, there was a chance that we could control the transmission. I also want to highlight some incredible teammates outside of the university that were absolutely critical. The Champaign-Urbana Public Health District was our kind of critical partner throughout this entire process. So Awais Vaid, I don't know if he's here, but I saw Julie in the back. We locked arms right from the beginning, and having a very strong relationship with our local public health was critical for the success of the SHIELD program. And literally, we were talking multiple times per day throughout the entire fall semester. It was an amazing team effort. And finally, I want to highlight that we were only successful because we had tremendous leadership on our campus. And I want to have a huge shout out. Our Vice Chancellor for Research now, Susan Martinez, our former Provost Andreas Congelares, our Chancellor Jones, and of course, President Tim Killeen were behind us every step of the way. In fact, Susan Martinez had even already put a lot of the kind of groundwork in place when Andreas called me and asked to help stand up fast frequent testing. She was already building the platform, gave us a huge head start. So pretty much the message we got from our leadership was, go make it happen, and we will get you every resource you need to be successful. And that was a really powerful lesson and message to send, and we decided to, of course, go after everything we could do to try to help. Okay, so getting back now to the kind of three-armed strategy, and ultimately, how did this play out in the context of our application? So when we started to dig into the data science to ask how could we develop a platform that could actually do this, this plot kind of summarizes the really key results. The orange area on this plot is the time in which someone is infected and they are still out in the community. The blue area is the time from which that person has been identified as positive and has now been safely isolated. All of the modeling suggested that the critical thing in terms of containing the spread of the virus, of course, was to reduce the orange and increase the blue. It was all about identifying those who were infected as fast as possible and getting them isolated. And we set as our goal to develop an assay and a system so most people could be detected before they spread the virus, okay? And this was a challenging goal because there were so many different pieces of the puzzle that had to snap into place to make that possible. But as I mentioned, what we found was the most important thing was testing fast and frequent, and twice per week was the charge that the data scientist left to us. If you looked at the data in terms of modeling across the entire campus, which we were very fortunately able to do, so we created an agent-based modeling of all 50,000 people. In a sense, in a computer, we're able to run scenarios and see what would happen if. And by doing that, we could, in a sense, test drive lots of different collections of mitigation strategies and see was there a combination that would give us a very high likelihood of success. The number 1 has a big dotted line because anything greater than 1 predicts failure. That means each person infected will infect at least more than 1 person. And if that happens, the math is brutal. We get an exponential increase in spread, and this is, of course, why so many communities ended up getting in a tough spot. If we only do masking, you can see it helps. It helps a lot, but it's nowhere close to enough. Numbers like 2.7 and 1.7, these are very rapid transmission and exponential spread on campus. If we added social distancing with masks, it helped a lot, but it was still not enough. And we knew these were conservative estimates and that not everyone would be 100% compliant. So even though that was factored into the model, masking and distancing was clearly not going to be sufficient. Now, if we add twice per week testing of everybody on campus, it's a dramatic effect. Not only we drop below 1, we substantially drop below 1, and all of a sudden starts to look like we could safely bring our students back to the university. We kept going and added manual contact tracing and an exposure notification app as part of the Rockwire platform, and now we're talking. We got down to less than 0.2, predictive of a safe return of our students to our campus. So now, this was, let's say, I think in May of 2020, so actually about 1 month after we were charged with this task, we knew what we had to do. The challenge was that there was no test on the planet at that time that could accomplish this. So this was a challenging situation. Now there was hope, and there was reasons to be optimistic, and Saliva had started to look like a very promising opportunity. And there are 2 studies that I want to highlight. One had shown, kind of as we had seen in our modeling, that if we tested daily, or at least every 3 days, lots of lines of evidence also suggested you could control the spread of SARS-CoV-2. And then there was a really important report that came from the Yale team, led by Ann Wiley and coworkers, which had shown that you could detect SARS-CoV-2 in saliva at least as sensitively as you could detect with the nasal swab, or the nasal pharyngeal assay. And this was really helpful because this gave us confidence that there might be an opportunity to do a really important advance in saliva testing that might actually get us there. Yet there were still really big challenges if we were going to think about a saliva-based test. It already looked a lot better than the nasopharyngeal swab. So if you remember, again, this is back in the spring of 2020, what we had was the nasopharyngeal assay, which involved really these 4 steps. So first you had to actually do the swab in the nose. Then you had to transport the sample from that swab into a system that was compatible with RNA isolation using what's called viral transport medium. Then you needed to have another special kit to do the RNA purification, that is, remove the RNA of the virus from the rest of its components. And then finally, after all of that, you could do a PCR reaction. And the problem was, is if you run the numbers, there was no way you could do this 100,000 times a week. There was also huge supply chain issues. So remember, there were no swabs, there was no viral transport media. We were actually trying to make some of it in the IGB to supply it to the state. And we were running out of RNA purification kits. And of course, it wasn't just us at Champaign-Urbana who needed all these things. Like, the whole world needed all these things. So there was this intense supply chain issue. Okay, there was a group at Rutgers who had actually gotten off to a very fast start and developed a saliva-based assay, which was really exciting. And they went from saliva collection directly then to this RNA purification kit. And it worked. So they had gotten a very early FDA EUA in April of 2020 for a saliva-based test. Now the problem was it still required this RNA purification. And that was a huge barrier. Not only did it take a long time, it was a whole nother step. So if you're going to create a robotic entity to do this, there was a whole nother set of robots that would have to do it. And there were very big supply chain issues associated with the RNA purification. And so at Illinois, Paul Hergenrother had this really exciting idea. What if we could go directly from the saliva to the PCR, skip all the intermediate steps? And if we could accomplish this, we could actually imagine pulling this off. We kind of ran the playbook, and they said this would get us there, 100,000 tests per week. The challenge was this was an unknown. There was no way this was known whether this could happen or not, and there were lots of reasons to think this shouldn't work. Okay, so to his credit, he was passionate and excited about the prospect and built a team around it. And these are the amazing individuals, the students, who then dove into the lab and launched what we have now redubbed the Champaign-Urbana Project. Okay, so this was an all-out, full-court press from May 3rd to June 18th, 2022. These students literally worked around the clock. I'm not sure they ever slept, and they just constantly were trying every different possible way you could imagine to go directly from saliva to the PCR machine and get a really sensitive assay for SARS-CoV-2. Ultimately, they ended up screening an extensive matrix. You can imagine all possible variables that you could consider in the context of such an experiment, and then they had a huge breakthrough. And the very exciting discovery was that if you simply heat human saliva that is infected with SARS-CoV-2, you accomplish three things all at once. You inactivate the virus, which makes it safer for the workers to work with. You break open the virus and actually expose its RNA, making it possible to do RT-PCR directly on the saliva sample. And last, very mysteriously, there's other stuff in saliva that messes with the PCR reaction, and something about heating it up at 95 degrees for 30 minutes kind of wipes out all of the competing entities in the saliva, and now you actually can do a really good RT-PCR assay. So all three of those we got in one shot just by a simple heating step, and ultimately this ended up becoming the backbone of the covidSHIELD assay. And so we published this paper. Actually, the Yale group was racing in kind of a very exciting, friendly competition all along the way, and they also had a really nice paper that came out around a similar time. Okay, so if we looked at the activity of the covidSHIELD assay in very stringent conditions, we were able to see that it was super sensitive. And this was very exciting because not only was it practical, but the fact that it was so sensitive, it suggested that we might be able to catch people who are infected before they are infectious, before they pass the virus on. And when we started comparing the covidSHIELD assay to other techniques, for example, saliva tests where you did do extraction, we saw kind of very similar results, actually perfect agreement. And then if we also compared it to nasal turbinates-based assays, you can see again, we had a very strong positive percent agreement and a very strong negative percent agreement. And ultimately then we compared even low viral load individuals by nasal as well as by saliva, and found we could detect even more sensitively with the saliva-based assay in terms of the CT value. Ultimately, this assay did get FDA EUA, and this is because of the heroic work by Jay Walsh, who's at the time interim vice president for economic development, and it was just an amazing all-out full-court press working with regulators to actually get this across the finish line, and huge thanks to Jay for his partnership on this. Okay, so once we had an assay and it looked really, really promising, now we had the challenge of the logistics. How do you test 20,000 people? How do you test 20,000 tests all week for 100,000 tests per week? It was a very big challenge. And so ultimately what we had to do was to build a brand new lab for human COVID-19 testing. We didn't have to start from scratch, however, because in Illinois, we were very lucky to have an amazing veterinary school, and there's a veterinary diagnostic lab headed by Rick Fredrickson, and Lei Wang, who's actually at the University of Illinois Vet Lab, had actually already started testing for COVID in tigers. So if you remember back in February, there was a report, I think in the New York Times, about tigers testing positive at the Bronx Zoo. This was Lei, actually, at the University of Illinois Vet Lab. And so we were pretty excited because if he can test in tigers, of course we can do our undergrads. So this looked like a really good takeoff point, despite their partying. So we teamed up with the veterinary lab, and Paul Hergenrother and Tim Fan already had a program that they had built. They called it Pets to People. They were trying to develop cancer drugs by testing in pet animals and then translating into humans. So it's like the engine was running, and now we were able to just lock in on this and transform the veterinary diagnostic lab into a human COVID-19 testing facility. And Tim Fan deserves a lion's share of the credit, or the tiger share, I guess, for actually accomplishing that. And it was just a heroic achievement. Ultimately, this is kind of a look into the lab. So we just built, we got a lot of PCR machines, we got a lot of robots, ultimately got them all wired up with support from a local company. And the second thing is we spread testing stations all across campus. So I think there were actually more than 20 of them spread out all across the campus so that students, the idea was you could just walk through a tent on your way to class. We wanted to try to make this just part of life. And we didn't know how long we were going to need to do this, so we just really tried to set it up so we could get back to business and test as you go. And so it was a huge team that worked to put all the logistics together. Craig Wagenack, Laura Wilhelm Barr, Mike DeLorenzo, and about like 150 other people. It was just an unbelievable team effort to set this up across the campus. And as mentioned, we also were very fortunate that Bill Sullivan and his team were able to create this app. It was, again, there were so many kind of crisis moments in the context of the SHIELD program. I remember when we were trying to get this approved by the Apple Store, which was, believe it or not, one of the biggest risks of getting started on time was getting this through the Apple team to agree to put this on their Apple Store so students could download. So, but the crisis was averted, and we ultimately got it just in time and able to use this to, again, turn the testing results into actionable intelligence to mitigate spread. Ultimately, one of the other key components here was to couple entry into a building with compliance with your testing. And the way we did this was simply the app said your access granted or denied based on whether you had recently received a negative test. And then we positioned students at the doors across the entire campus, and they checked your app on the way in. So we launched, and we tested. And we tested, and we tested, and we tested. And we ramped up fast over the summer and ultimately reached about 20,000 tests per day. There was a time when we were performing about 2 to 3% of all the tests in the entire United States in our little vet lab at Illinois. So it was a pretty ambitious task to undertake. It was not easy. There were a lot of hiccups along the way, but ultimately we were able to get up to that level. And the students were awesome. Like 99% of them were awesome. We'll talk about that in a second. And they volunteered, and they inspired each other, and they reminded each other, and they showed up. I mean, it was just incredible. And from the beginning, we really tried to make this a partnership in every way, including with our students. So we had a team of 35,000 plus the minute they came back. And this was one of the key reasons for our success. So how did we do? So we had some very encouraging results over the summer. So if you look on the kind of left side of this slide, we did some pilots, and we saw our kind of percents drop over the summer amongst a smaller group that was hanging out, and this looked really encouraging. Then the students came back. And by August 15th, about 3 days before they arrived, we had finally gotten the lab fully up and running. And when they arrived, we had predicted about 200 or 300 of them should be infected. So we ran all of our agent-based modeling, and it suggested that as long as everyone was compliant, we would see a small bump, and it should come right back down, and we could lay low the whole semester. That's what the modeling told us. So they came back, and again, about 99% of them did everything we asked, but not all. And the math about COVID is brutal. A few of them, I think we said in the paper, chose activities inconsistent with recommendations. And it was incredible to see how impactful a few bad decisions were in the context of exponential viral spread. So there were a few parties, and at exactly those places, we saw these spikes. And then because we had all the data, we saw those spikes spread. It was wild. But the key was we had the surveillance system up and running, and so we saw it immediately. I remember it was like a Friday at 4 o'clock when the alarm bells were going off and everybody's jumping on the calls and everybody's trying to figure out what's going on. And we had the dashboard, all the data right in front of us. We had the testing, we had the contact tracing, everything. And so we realized this surveillance aspect was key. So we knew we had a problem and we had opportunity to fix it. So we did 3 things. First, the data told us more than 95% of all the cases were coming from undergraduates. And we knew which undergraduates and where they lived. So we could actually target 3 times per week testing in all the areas that were hotspots. The second thing is we gave them 2 weeks for essential activities only. Importantly, we never stopped classes and we never stopped research. But that was pretty much all they were allowed to do. And the third thing was the data suggested we were missing a lot of people from when we knew they were positive to when we got them isolated. That window was way too long. So we launched a new team. We called it SHIELD Team 30. The idea was we're going to find you and get you isolated in 30 minutes. So it turns out we got it down to about 10 minutes. It was really exciting. So we had a whole team launch just to do that. First, we started calling them. Then we realized young people don't answer their phone. So we switched to text and social media applications. And ultimately, we were able to get this time frame down much shorter. And you can see the results. So we had this spike, okay, where it was super stressful. We had one day we had like 200 people test positive. But you can see how fast the change in the strategy works. So we were dynamic. And we were data-driven dynamic. And I think that was really key. So things came right back down. And excitingly, as you can see on the bottom, we were testing like mad, okay? So these are like, 15,000 tests per day, almost every day. Again, 2 to 3% of all the tests in the US were happening in a university campus down south. And so ultimately, we learned a lot. So not only did we bring down the numbers, but we actually were able, in real time, to learn a lot about how testing related to spread. We could see that if we tested frequently, we were detecting people at much higher CT values, which meant their viral load was very low. And in fact, data suggesting we were catching them before they were even infectious. Okay, so this was very promising in terms of our ability to mitigate. We also found we were doing a lot better than antigen testing. We teamed up with our sports teams who were actually testing everybody with antigen tests and saliva tests every day, and we could actually compare the results. So as you can just see here, there were, for example, a bunch of positive tests by covidSHIELD that didn't get detected by the antigen test. And then we could also look at the kind of mean CT value across all the different people who were testing positive, and was giving us confidence that most of them we were detecting very early before they were infectious. I talked about that one spike that happened at the beginning of the semester. We actually had 3 other mini spikes throughout the semester. One was around Halloween, which was interesting, and then another one after they came back from Thanksgiving, et cetera. But what you can see from these data, in all 4 of these periods, we had a rise, and then rapidly, with fast frequent testing, we were able to crush it and bring it right back down, and that was the key. Okay, it wasn't about perfection, it was about dynamic, responsive action, and we were able to keep things under control. The other kind of key way to look at these data, we were very, of course, concerned that our undergraduate transmission was going to transmit to our faculty and staff, who are much older and much more vulnerable, and or to our community. But as you can see from this plot, our undergrads had that spike, but because we brought it down fast, we saw no transmission to our faculty or staff. The same thing was true to our community. And so we were able to compare positivity rates from all these different vectors and see that we were effective in keeping the transmission amongst our undergraduates from spreading out into these 2 vulnerable populations. By the end of the semester and then early into the next, we were also able to start teaming up with other communities who had heard what we were doing and wanted to see if they could apply it in their context. So we ran at another university, a high school's courthouse, again at a private company, and 4 out of 4 times we were able to see once SHIELD was initiated in these other environments, the positivity rates fell. And so this was starting to give us a lot of confidence that this was not only working at Illinois, but could work in a lot of other places. And very importantly, this whole time, we kept teaching, and the students kept learning, and heroically, to their credit, they did it with their masks on, they stayed apart, they studied outside, they found quiet spaces on their own, and we just kept chugging along. We also kept doing research, and we kept having fun. And most of them did it in a really safe, very thoughtful way. I was driving around campus and seeing people playing football outside with masks on. It was a pretty heartening thing to see. So again, huge kudos to the students. And then, as soon as the vaccines were available, we had a huge campaign to try to get everyone vaccinated, and the students stepped up. And again, like 99% of them ended up getting vaccinated in very short order, really tried to lead in that regard. And most importantly, at the end of the day, that meant our students remained on track. They got their educations, and of course, super excited to see they eventually made it through and went off on their way. I think the most important data slide I'll share today is this one. With Rebecca Smith, we were able ultimately to model, along with her postdoc, Johnny Ullman, across the entire country, there are 251 counties that have a large university with more than 15,000 students. Here we're plotting on the Y and X axis the predicted versus the observed mortality in all 251 of those counties, mortality based on COVID-19. What you can see here is we are way off the line. And in fact, out of all 251 counties, we are the #1 biggest discrepancy between predicted and observed. There's a more than 4-fold reduction in COVID-19 deaths in Champaign County, which translates to hundreds of lives saved. And this was able to then put real data behind the stories I was telling you and allowed us to become very helpful in terms of teaching others how to do the same thing. So some of the key takeaways from that first semester, I won't read all of them, but just to highlight. First, we learned that fast, frequent testing can help mitigate the spread of SARS-CoV-2 in a large and open and active public university. We also saw across that semester the positivity rates generally remained below 0.5%. We had 0 hospitalizations or deaths amongst our UIUC community. We had no evidence of transmission, and we looked in concert with CUPHD. We tried to find evidence in classrooms or laboratories, and there was 0. And we also saw no evidence of transmission from our students to our faculty or staff or to our surrounding community. We also learned testing is not enough. It has to be integrated with all of these other measures, non-pharmaceutical interventions to actually keep things under control. Most of our initial positive tests were people who were asymptomatic. That was a really important message that we helped sing loud and clear to help argue for more testing in many other situations. The test itself turned out to be remarkably robust and effective and efficient and scalable, as you now know. More than 20 million covidSHIELD tests have now been run all over the world. Data-driven dynamic prioritization was key. We knew we had to get people isolated fast. And ultimately, I think safe socialization was critical. We tried to take an eyes wide open approach. I mean, this is a very active group of young people. You can't just tell them you cannot have fun, ever. It's just not gonna work. And so finding ways to partner with them was also really important. As mentioned at the beginning, we as the SHIELD team were in a position to try to share our learnings in real time. So we ended up talking with a lot of different organizations, and by doing so, spread the message across the country and the world of what we were doing in our small town in the middle of Illinois. And we were very excited to see that the lessons we were learning in real time had a very big impact in many other different communities. Rebecca Smith and her team, in partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation, also put together a SHIELD K-12 playbook, which really helped get SHIELD into many different schools and empower the people who are leading those schools to implement in a way that was best for them. And of course, as you know, and why we're here today, some really heroic leadership from Wanda Ward and Neil Cohen for SHIELD CU, Ron Watkins for SHIELD Illinois, and then Bill with SHIELD T3. We're ultimately able to take the concept that we had kind of test-driven in our small community in Champaign-Urbana, and then bring it to, obviously, the county, the state, and the country and the world. And so this was a just tremendous team effort, brilliant it out. I love this one. It just kind of, I think this is actually outdated at this point of all the sites, but you can just see how SHIELD sites spread, again, across the state, across the country, even to other countries, and it was just really exciting to see that all happen. In many of those situations, there was evidence that SHIELD was working, and there was a lot of attention paid to this, and ultimately, of course, I think it was a really exciting highlight to our community, what we can accomplish together and how it can impact the world. One of my favorite quotes from an interview with CNN, Poppy Harlow saying, some pretty important things from this country have come from that university for sure, and I think it's very exciting to think about if we can do SHIELD, what can we do next? So I'll just close by giving you a sense of what we're dreaming about moving forward, given what's happened with SHIELD. You know, every crisis is an opportunity. And I think one of the key things that we learned through SHIELD is that if we team up and decide to stop at nothing to try to solve a problem together, I mean, there's probably not much we can't do. So how do we take that momentum and all those learnings, and now let's go really on offense, right? We can look around and see some really challenging problems we face in society, and could the kind of mission-oriented nature with which we launched and executed the SHIELD program, could we take that model and now apply it to lots of other important challenges that we face in society? We're calling this kind of mission-oriented research, which could be a very exciting model for how we go after problem solving in the future. Okay, so in that spirit, I'm just going to tell you about one activity that we just launched at the University of Illinois that we're really excited about that aims to build on that exact momentum. So we're calling this the Democratized Drug Discovery Initiative, or the D3I. The whole mission is to find medicines together for diseases that have largely remained unmet needs in our society, despite all the advances we've seen in modern medicine. And there are challenges with many of these diseases because they don't fit the bill for what drug companies can typically choose to work on, because they may or may not have a good kind of ROI that matches the desire in terms of the investment. Whereas at the University of Illinois, we are a land-grant institution, so we can choose differently. And the idea here is to enable impact-driven decision-making when it comes to what to go after in terms of drug discovery, and perhaps we can be a super complementary force for finding medicines for diseases that have remained underserved. So there's 3 areas that we think kind of fall into this set of diseases. We can talk about rare diseases, okay, which sometimes affect smaller numbers of patients, but across the entire overall population, they actually end up adding up to a lot of unmet need. There's a bunch of cancers that disproportionately affect marginalized groups and unfortunately end up getting much less attention. And the same is true with infectious diseases. It's very hard to make money on antibiotics, and therefore a lot of drug companies aren't working on them. And yet, there's just tremendous science and opportunity to actually find better antimicrobials. And so we're launching a campaign, kind of this mission-oriented research effort, where we say these are the types of diseases that we could identify, and then can we form teams to go after them in a democratized drug discovery way where impact is the primary selection criterion in terms of tackling one of these diseases. The other thing that's very exciting that's happening at the University of Illinois is that we've started to get pretty good at finding medicines and then spinning them out into translational projects. So there's one clinically approved drug that has come out of the University of Illinois, Yondelis, by my colleague Ken Reinhardt, now years ago. And if you just look across this timeline, since that initial kind of discovery, very recently things have just exploded. So all of these are actually spin-out biotech companies coming right out of the University of Illinois, even just in the last 5 to 10 years, by founders at the university. And many of these are now in clinical trials. So it's starting to look really exciting. Now, if you take the y-axis and expand it 100 times, we think we probably just hit the inflection point of what might be possible. So we can do this. The other really important thing to recognize is that small molecules, which make up most of the medicines that we all take, that type of chemical matter is really good at making drugs. The problem has been that the process of making those molecules isn't great. And it's been a huge barrier in terms of innovation in this space. And it's pretty much meant that only those of us who went and got a PhD in organic synthesis can actually participate in the process. So we want to change that. And other fields like computer science and astronomy have figured out ways to shatter those barriers and create democratized engines for discovery. You can go on a NASA website now and actually find exoplanets, even if you have no background in astrophysics or astronomy. And because they've literally put together these democratized engines, they almost gamified planet discovery. And so if you can discover a planet hundreds of millions of light years away without formal training, don't tell me you can't help find molecules, okay? So we think this is possible. We've also, at University of Illinois, created a robotic platform for molecule making. And this used to be a dream, and now it's actually a reality. And so there are kind of a Lego-like situation where you can create little building blocks, and then using robots, you can snap those blocks together and make molecules, even if you've never had formal training in the process. And we think this could be a really disruptive technology that help us kind of democratize the medicine-making process. So I just want to tell you one story to show this can actually work. So this Lego-like chemistry has actually yielded 3 spin-out companies, all of which have drugs that are either in the clinic now or headed there soon. And the one I'll tell you about in the middle, there's a disease called cystic fibrosis, many of you probably heard of. It's caused by a missing anion channel protein in your airway. And so we secrete things like bicarbonate to protect our lungs from getting infected. And if you're missing this protein, you can't secrete bicarbonate, and therefore you get, for example, Pseudomonas infections, which unfortunately cause a very early morbidity and mortality. The idea was, could we find a small molecule that could replace the missing protein, almost operating like a prosthesis on the molecular scale? Okay, this was the concept. And in order to get at this, we used the Lego chemistry to make some of these molecular prosthetics. And I'm very excited to tell you that we found one. And so ultimately, we have a molecule that kind of acts like the missing protein, but it's just a medicine that you could take or even inhale. And so we teamed up with Emily Kramer-Golenkoff, who, if you want a very inspiring Google search this afternoon, I would check her out. So she's an amazing young woman with cystic fibrosis who's frustrated because none of the currently available medicines work for her because she has mutations that make no protein. So it's this complete loss of protein function. And so to her credit, rather than just get frustrated, she starts her own foundation. She raised millions of dollars, and then she funded our clinical trial. And so this was the result. So we were able to get 8 people at the University of Iowa in collaboration with Mike Welsh, and we put the molecular prosthetic in their nose. And so these are 8 people with cystic fibrosis who couldn't benefit from any current treatments. And as you can see from this plot, down is good. So 7 out of 8 of them showed a reduction in their what's called nasal potential difference, showing that they were getting more anion secretion in their nose. This was a very exciting result based on precedent. Looks like it could be a very promising translation into patients' lungs. And so we started a company called Systemic Medicines, which, full disclosure, I'm a founder and advisor for the company. And they've put together a dry powdered inhaler, which is about to enter clinical trials. Okay, so how do we get everyone into the medicine-making business? And this is actually where we've built now the Molecule Maker Lab at the University of Illinois. The concept is to bring the power of this molecular innovation to all 8 billion imaginations we have on our planet. Of course, think about it, it's our greatest natural resource. It's what AI still can't do. Can we figure out a way to get all of that imagination potential to go after something we all care about? Perhaps the only thing we can all agree on is everybody wants to be healthy. So therefore, if we could have everybody have the opportunity to help get there, this could be very powerful. This is our vision for what the future of drug discovery might look like. This is a shot from the Lego store, actually, here in Chicago. I love the wall on the back. My kids and I will spend hours back there. You can make anything you want. You only pay for what you made. It's actually a really cool way to spend the afternoon. So we're trying to build kind of a Lego kit for drug discovery, specifically focusing on a class called kinase inhibitors as a takeoff point. Turns out we have about 550 of these in our body, and only about 10% of them have successfully been drugged. That means more than 90% of that opportunity remains. So yet we have a really good roadmap of what types of molecules can do it because there are about 86 of them clinically approved. So how do we democratize the discovery of new kinase inhibitors so that we can find ones for rare diseases and other cancers, et cetera, that have largely gone unmet need? So we've created this Lego kit for these kinase inhibitors. I won't get into all the details, but the bottom line is that this is now evolving into a platform where anyone with even a non-science background, we think, could play an important role in trying to contribute to this discovery. We also have an entire robotic system that we're building to do automated testing. You can notice some of the names here. Paul Hergenrother and I are teaming up on this, so it's a very exciting next kind of future adventure that we're looking forward to. And this really nicely dovetails with the Institute for Cancer that's being developed at the university as well. Okay, so the construct that we're imagining around this, again, kind of this mission-oriented research, is to really build teams, just like we did with SHIELD. Again, one of the coolest things about the SHIELD program was it wasn't just the specialist in microbiology and chemistry. There was like 200 people across campus all working together on an all-out full-court press mission, right, to solve a problem. And when we all started going together, obviously really good things happened. And so we think now we just need to put a target in the middle, analogously build a team, create that same sense of urgency and common purpose, and then go after it. And so we think this could be a very exciting, different way to think about discovering tomorrow's medicines. All right, the last thing I'll just mention, a lot of people feel very skeptical that this would be possible, which is okay. We like that challenge. But I would just point to computer science as a pretty inspiring example. So I'll just share a personal story. My kids one night, they were in kindergarten and first grade, and they started laughing at me at dinner because they found out that I don't know how to code. And they actually, at the time, my kindergartner leaned over and he's like, "Dad, please don't tell anybody. It's really embarrassing." It's like, don't tell you don't know how to read. It's like this kind of thing. And the reason was because they had learned how to code in elementary school. And it was through this program called Scratch, which had been created at MIT specifically for the purpose of democratizing computer science. This was intentional. It's not by accident that all of the young people now know how to code and create apps to solve problems. It was an intentional empowerment that computer science did. That's how they took over the world. And they didn't stop there. They created Scratch Junior, which was literally targeted for elementary school kids. And the whole concept here is you just drag and drop these little building blocks of code. So you don't need to know the ones and zeros. You can just drag blocks that say move up, move down, left, right, jump, and it really made coding easy and fun. They turned into a game. So we're trying to do the same thing. Okay, so we've created a digital molecule maker. Imagine a kind of a computer program where you can just drag and drop building blocks. And even if you don't know exactly how the chemistry works, if we represent those blocks in terms of their functional modules, then we can reimagine even how we teach chemistry and bring everybody into the framework and ultimately then bring everybody into the making space. And so, of course, we had to make a digital molecule maker junior, and we've got elementary school kids coming in now regularly, learning a little bit about artificial intelligence and a little bit about molecule making, and then they get to go into our molecule maker lab and, quote, 3D print their molecules. And our hope is that they all go home and laugh at their parents that they don't know how to make molecules, okay? So with that, I'll just end. Thank you so much again for having me. When you look across our campus, across our state, across our country and our world, I think there's just no challenge we couldn't solve if we team up and go after it together. I think SHIELD taught us that, and now looking forward, let's make sure we tackle some really important problems together. Thank you so much again. Happy to answer questions.
I guess we have like 2 minutes for questions. So if anyone has a question, we can do a quick question.
Hi there. So I don't know if you read the book on AI by Eric Schmidt and Kissinger and that, but it actually goes into molecule discovery, and it talks about leveraging AI and machine learning to look at models and to guess the geometry. And I'm wondering how that relates to your model and your thought on that.
Great, thanks for the question. Yes, people are very excited, of course, AI plus X, right? Everyone, it's like a gold rush to figure out how we could discover better, faster, stronger with AI as a partner. I think two things that we're thinking a lot about. The first is, yes, a lot of people are trying to do this. The challenge everyone else is running into is this making bottleneck. So the history of organic synthesis is only about 200 years old, and it's a very customized process. So almost every molecule is its own unique challenge, and people almost go out of their way to celebrate how differently they make every molecule. It's like a weird, interesting thing about our culture. Whereas in other fields, of course, they gravitate toward general solutions that ultimately can be simple, modular, automated, and that's what causes these exponential explosions in innovation. So what we're trying to do is change the way we make molecules so that it becomes much easier to automate and integrate with AI and ultimately democratize. So the Lego-like thing, that's kind of new. That's what we've done at Illinois that's different. And it allows us to actually loop around. So you can imagine kind of AI decides what to make next. The robots automatically make on demand the molecules that will teach the algorithm the most. Then you get automatic testing and the data goes back to the AI. So we call it a closed loop. And the reason why that usually doesn't work is because you kind of come to a screeching halt at the making part. So this is the first time we actually can loop around. And we've done it now. We've found lasers. We found organophotovoltaics. It's starting to look like a general solution. And so it just becomes almost like a very sophisticated tool. And so as an outsider, you can come in and rightly feel empowered to drive this engine towards a function that you care about. And I think that's going to be kind of really exciting. The last thing I'll just say is I think some people, unfortunately, are trying to go after this idea of robots and AI replacing people. But I think it's the wrong way to think about it. The chess master and the AI, right, there was a big competition, and the AI ultimately beat the chess master. I mean, that's old news. But still, AI plus a chess master can always beat the AI. So humans and AI work together better, and there's still something we can do in our gut instinct and our imagination that AI can't yet do. It's going to be true for at least 100 years, I think. And so now's the time for us to leverage that collaboration between AI and people to take on challenges we weren't able to address before. That's the second key piece we're thinking about. How about take one more? He looks like he's got a good question.
I was just curious, does your model maker, does it have the ability to predict like solubility, toxicology, biodistribution? With, when you're putting these different
Yeah, awesome. Not yet, but that's where we're headed. And we think about the closed loop, not only to just define drugs, but to learn the rules. So you can kind of map the space in an AI-guided way to learn about structure-function relationships that relate to all the parameters you talked about. Imagine that you could run an engine nonstop. It's not high throughput. It's actually small throughput on demand over and over and over again. Data science-driven cluster analysis to know what to try next, kind of DOE with multiple dimensions, et cetera. You can learn so much so fast. So anyway, we're going to try to map the whole space by iterating and then get to the point where you could predict pretty confidently, or at least have that be a part of what helps you succeed. That's where we're headed. I think someone said, has it made any molecules? Yes. So we've published a bunch on this, and I'll just tell you real quick, we recently discovered the world's best organic laser using this closed loop discovery with teammates from Toronto and the UK. And we also recently found a better organophotovoltaic using a similar closed loop strategy. And so we've got 2 hits in the material space, and so now we're pretty excited to move into the therapeutic space. That's where we're headed. Awesome. Okay, thank you so much again for having me.